Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Sheri Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on June 16th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, as usual, my housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. And from there, you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent podcast and or search the archived listings for any which you may have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. The show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen live or you can listen anytime after. And while you're there, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which includes friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, actually needs to be happy. This is based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yeah, it's going to sign you up for my Karmic Conversations About Consciousness newsletter, but you can subscribe anytime. You can unsubscribe anytime, of course. So be sure to grab that freebie when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom. Now, separately, you can always follow me on social media on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and that's where you can keep track of upcoming or past podcast content and other astro news you can use. I post now on Instagram under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there as well. And finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, and this offer is for podcast listeners only. My normal rate is $180, and that's usually for about an hour and a half. But if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and at a lower cost, then this reading is for you. If you'd also like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back now from achieving your most cherished desires in whatever area is of greatest interest to you, your relationships, your career and your job, your finances, or your health, then this reading again is for you. We'll look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns, or what I call conditioned behavior, and how this knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, well, that's easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer for a Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125. And that's available at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so let's get into this week's astro news you can use. The Gemini New Moon will be arriving at 26 degrees and 11 minutes of the chatty sign of elementary and rudimentary learning, communication, and siblings at 9:37 p.m. Pacific time on June 17th and 12:37 a.m. Eastern time on June 18th. And when it does, it's going to ask us to plant seeds that will blossom into a healthy sense of curiosity about which partnerships are most likely to nurture and sustain us over the long term, and which will not. Further, this lunation asks us, or is going to ask us, to adapt quickly, especially on a mental level, away from those who may have betrayed or deceived us in the past. And that's regardless of whether such deceit was intentional on the part of another or others, or whether it was caused by at least a certain measure of self-deceit. In short, we're going to be asked to contemplate at this Gemini New Moon whether our faith in any specific relationship may have been misplaced, and if so, how we might plant seeds that blossom into the recovery of our sense of trust in partnerships in general. And that's because the Gemini Sun and Moon will both conjoin the asteroid goddess Juno at this lunation, while simultaneously forming a mutable T-square to Neptune in Pisces, which opposes dwarf planet Ceres, the goddess of nurturing and sustenance. Ceres is often referred to as a minor moon, in the sense that, that's why I say nurturing, because, and I've explained this on past podcasts, but she is the Greek, Demeter was the Greek, Ceres the Roman goddess of fertility of the crops. So she had a lot to do with agriculture. She's aligned sometimes with the moon, sometimes with Virgo, in her ability to allow the seed to be fertilized and the crops to grow, which of course provides food for humans and thus sustains us. Demetra George, in her wonderful book, The Asteroid Goddesses, also points out that Ceres, because it has a lot to do with food, can also be prominent in charts of those who have eating disorders. But in general, I look at her as a means of sustenance. And because sustenance comes in literal food, but also in our sense of faith that the seasons will continue to revolve and the crops will continue to be planted and then harvested, and then we eat them and thus sustain ourselves, especially through the winter when the crops are not plentiful in the northern and western hemisphere, which is where Greek and Roman mythology derive from. So, back to the Gemini New Moon. One of the things the Gemini archetype is known for is its quick ability to mentally adapt. And this is an important point to make as we wind down the end of the last monthly lunar cycle right now, just prior to entering the new monthly lunar cycle within the next day or two. First, though, it's important to understand that no monthly lunar cycle functions completely in isolation or on its own. All of them are part of the larger cycles of the planets that keep us moving forward in terms of our ability to grow in consciousness. So when we look at what came before, the current monthly lunar cycle, which began with the Taurus New Moon on May 19th, we may remember now that we were to plant a new set of values then, ones that might replace the set of old, outdated, no longer relevant ones. Now, I may sound, again, like I'm repeating myself from past podcasts, but I really think, and what I want to point out to people is how prevalent this month's lunar cycle has been and what it may lead to. So, after the new moon on May 19th, at the May 27th first quarter lunar square of the Virgo moon to the Gemini sun, we pushed through the early waxing stages of this month's lunar cycle by tending to the health of the seeds planted on or around May 19th. And at the Sagittarius full moon on June 3rd, we recognized that what was planted had ripened and that it was then time to harvest the fruit off of the vine, so to speak. Therefore, it was then that we were asked to release the old, weeded out, no longer relevant values of yore, so that we could make something manifest out of what was originally planted on May 19th. We might recall now, too, that as part of the Taurus New Moon's monthly cycle, it was at that June 3rd Sagittarius full moon that a U.S. debt ceiling compromise was agreed upon, and it was a day later on June 4th when it was signed into law by President Joe Biden just in the nick of time before the June 5th deadline when the U.S. Department of Treasury had predicted that the government would default on its debt. Remember, too, that Venus-ruled Taurus has to do with values, which often translates into issues to do with money and finances. What kinds of resources do we value? And one of our resources, of course, is money, because money is what enables us to buy resources such as land upon which to build a home, and if we don't own it, we rent it. Jobs that allow us to pay for the home and pay for our food, which is a resource, and pay for our utilities, and et cetera, et cetera. So next, after that, came the waning, disseminating monthly lunar phase, which is defined as when the moon is between 135 to 90 degrees behind the sun after its 180-degree full moon phase. Now, astrologer Bernadette Brady describes this phase in her predictive astrology book as one during which, and here I quote from her book, "The harvest is over. That which has not been reaped now has to be left behind. You are now at a stage of realizing that the lovely swelling of the full moon has stopped, and all that can be achieved has been achieved from the present pathway. It is now time to examine the crop and reevaluate, to think about the current position, to extract the most from what has recently been harvested." So it's interesting to note that it was during this period between June 3rd's Sagittarius full moon and the June 10th third quarter monthly lunar square, during this disseminating phase, that Donald Trump, the twice impeached, convicted sexual predator and defamer, ex-U.S. president, was formally indicted on federal criminal charges under the Espionage Act by the DOJ on June 8th. So as we entered the third quarter waning lunar phase, June 10th, no, I'm sorry, this was before I said it was disseminating, but the disseminating phase is since that. So as we entered the third quarter waning lunar phase on June 10th, which is still in effect right now until the upcoming Gemini New Moon starts a new monthly cycle, June 17th and 18th, we saw the former president arraigned at a federal courthouse in Miami, Florida, the state in which the DOJ claims the alleged crimes of which he's accused took place, which is why, of course, there was a grand jury there, although people didn't know about it, or not many people knew about it, and were shocked when this indictment came down. So now we're in, hang on a second, because I want to clarify for you, because I think I may have confused you, even though I thought I was clear. So what happens is we have the full moon, and that's 180 degrees, and then we have the disseminating moon. So that's when the moon moves behind the sun. Well, it's catching up to the sun, but it's only 135 to 90 degrees. At 90 degrees, we have the third quarter moon, and at 45 degrees between the moon and the sun, as the moon is en route to meeting the sun again, and it's part of its monthly lunar cycle, we have the balsamic phase. And that's where we are right now, because we're only a day or two behind the next new moon, which happens to be the Gemini New Moon. So Bernadette Brady defines this, again, as when the transiting moon is within 45 degrees of the sun prior to their meeting at the next new moon's cycle, as follows, and here I quote, "This is the clearing of the old ground to make sure that there is room in your life for the new cycle to come in. You are future-oriented rather than preoccupied with the past. It is a time of release. If something wants to leave your life, let it go, for its space will be filled with the seeds of the new moon." Now, it's important for me to mention that Bernadette Brady's book, Predictive Astrology, and her description of these lunar phases is actually for the progressed moon, which is a 27.5-year cycle. But it's based on the monthly lunar cycle. It's just that it's a longer period. So we're looking at the microcosm here, all right? And I mentioned last week that the symbolism of Venus entering Leo June 5th, which is again just after the June 3rd Sagittarius full moon, and then opposing Pluto in Aquarius that same day, which was, like I said, just 2 days after the full moon, and during the beginning of the waning portion of this monthly lunar cycle, when those Taurus New Moon seeds planted on May 19th came to fruition. And that was the day one of the worst spies in U.S. history, Robert Hasan, who betrayed America by passing classified information to the Russians, was found dead in his prison cell just hours before the Venus, newly in Leo, opposition to Pluto and Aquarius perfected. And just after Trump was indicted 2 days later, again during the early portion of the waning monthly lunar cycle, it became clear that Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, had betrayed him in return for partial immunity with the Department of Justice. Meanwhile, the unsealing of the indictment a day later revealed the depths of Trump's betrayal of America, just as Hasan had done years before, based on the DOJ charges that Trump had not only illegally kept documents meant for the National Archives, meaning that they're property belonging to the people and are not to remain in a former president's possession, but boasted about it to many, not to mention the public at large. I had also noted last week the recent death of the Unabomber, likewise found in his prison cell, and they believe his death was caused by suicide, and the synchronicity of his being a quote-unquote mad genius who sought revenge on those involved in technological advancement. In fact, he sent the bombs to several of his, I'm not sure if they were professors or classmates or both, at Harvard when he was studying mathematics there. But I felt that bringing his memory to the forefront at that particular point in time emphasized the mad part. So throw the fact that evangelical leader Pat Robinson also died on June 8th into the mix, and we get betrayal of the American public through religious righteousness, an energy co-opted by Trump, who, big surprise, hasn't really a religious bone in his body. So when we put it all together, astrologically or otherwise, the biggest theme during this past month's lunar cycle has been betrayal, at least in my opinion. Now, the biggest question is whether folks will wake up and realize they've been betrayed, or whether they'll persist in continuing to righteously deny this fact. And that's where the upcoming Gemini New Moon comes in, especially since it will conjoin asteroid goddess Juno, who I said is known as the wife or partner from Greek and Roman mythology. Juno's the wife of Jupiter in the latter, as Hera was the wife of Zeus in the former, and form a mutable cross as the 3 square Neptune in Pisces, which is opposing dwarf planet Ceres, which I already mentioned is the goddess of the grain and the harvest who made the crops grow, and Ceres is currently transiting through Virgo. So the Gemini Moon, Sun, and Juno, representative of with whom we partner and communicate, together square Neptune, the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion in watery Pisces, and the dwarf planet of Ceres, that which sustains us in Virgo. So coming after a monthly lunar cycle that's illustrated a great deal of past betrayal through events within the collective And given that one of Gemini's biggest archetypal traits revolves around quick mental adaptation, it stands to reason that at this Gemini new moon, we're asked to plant seeds that will help us mentally adapt to new circumstances and new information, because they will reflect what was planted at the Taurus new moon, newfound values. Now, I note here that since Venus ruled the Taurus new moon, the sign through which Uranus has been transiting since 2018, that at times since, and I know I've mentioned this before as well, during these past 5 years, since the spring of 2018 to the spring of 2023, major changes have taken place concerning what we thought we valued most. Like, say, for example, having a job to which we commuted, and now experiencing the change that we might value more working from home, or that we might value more working in a completely different industry or a completely different company, etc. I mean, I think it almost goes without mention saying that we really had reinforced who we valued most when we were denied access to them. Grandparents unable to see their grandchildren, children unable to see their parents if they were in an assisted living or a nursing home because of COVID-19. So I don't think we need to relive all of that, but I do think that it's obvious that even if it took a while, 2 years or so, Uranus and Taurus has most definitely shifted our sense of what we value most from what we thought we valued most prior to that period in time. And this has also been part of the macrocosm of slower moving planetary energies under which auspices fall the faster monthly lunar cycles and the cycles of other faster moving planets, such of course as the moon and the sun, which is the lunar cycle, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. So given all of this information from the collective, it's at this upcoming Gemini new moon lunation that we may plant seeds that enable us to mentally pivot so that we can adapt quickly to new information, and that new information causes new circumstances. And that's especially since this new moon's ruler Mercury is in quick thinking Gemini from now until June 26, when we'll doubtless continue to have a lot of information thrown our way between now and then. So the questions we might ask ourselves now, and this is more on a personal level, is what's confused us about any of our partnerships, or what's confusing us, or what has confused us in the past? How do we discern whether or not others have been truthful with us in the past? And if they have not, can we tell if they outright deceived us, or if perhaps we bear some of the blame because they told us what we wanted to hear rather than the simple truth? So we might begin again with our personal lives and extend these questions to the outside world, or we might do the opposite. Depends on how you roll, right? Look at where we've been confused or deceived by public figures or others who have some sway over our lives, such as bosses or politicians or corporate CEOs or even celebrities, and then check in with the microcosm of our own lives. It's always an as above, so below deal, my friends. So if we look at the current political situation here in the U.S. right now, we can see pretty clearly how the tide is beginning to turn as we're in the balsamic phase, as I speak this, of the lunar cycle before we get to the Gemini new moon. So some of this is also exemplified right now by the less than strong support for Donald Trump by even some in the GOP as they begin to fully digest and understand the import of the charges against him in this latest indictment. So again, what I'm trying to point out to everyone here is that we are right now in the balsamic phase of the monthly lunar cycle, clearing that path, taking what we learned and understood from the monthly lunar cycle, and now clearing out everything so that we can plant those seeds and start to grow something new at this next lunar cycle in 2-3 days. So it was Keith Olbermann who mentioned just yesterday on his Countdown podcast, during the dark of the moon balsamic portion of this monthly lunar cycle, that several of those running for the GOP presidential nomination, such as Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and others, have begun to criticize Trump for potentially endangering both our military, domestic and foreign operatives who work for the U.S., and the security of not just the U.S., but other nations' nuclear secrets, etc. It's easy to Google, if you don't already know, what kinds of documents Trump was bandying about to people who had no right to access them because they had no, they hadn't been declassified. Remember, too, that the issue with Trump's indictment is not about whether those documents were classified or not. It's about whether or not he had the right to take them, and also about his refusal to acknowledge that he took them, or took all of them. He did return some of them initially, but that he refused to return them. But in any case, because he's, as I said, showed some of these documents to people who were not authorized to see them, such careless exposure of U.S. top secret information to potential U.S. enemies or others who don't have U.S. interests first and foremost at heart endangers every American, as the DOJ's indictment alleges. And therein lies this mental pivot that we have to make now. So as the other, big news is that Saturn stations retrograde in Pisces on June 17th, just prior to the Gemini New Moon. So Saturn retrograde and Neptune ruled, which is the modern ruler, or Jupiter ruled, if you prefer traditional Pisces, just prior to the exact Gemini New Moon, helps us review where our real foundation lies. And the answer to that will always focus on what makes us feel most secure. So again, you can see the correlation between the Taurus New Moon monthly lunar cycle, which has to do with which resources we value most. We can see the bigger picture is in Uranus and Taurus having changed our opinions or attitudes or feelings about what we value most over the past particularly 2-3 years. And and Saturn, which represents building a foundation that helps us feel most secure. So Saturn in Pisces since March 7th requires us to bridge the divide between our core ego's empirically derived beliefs, i.e., if I can see it, then I can believe it, and the soul's true wisdom, which lies hidden beneath the conscious realm, or beneath the realm of empirical consciousness. So Saturn's retrograde period in this watery sign and at this particular lunation asks us to dive deeply into what we didn't know we don't know, and to square that with what we intuitively, instinctively do know deep in our bones. And how do we do this? Well, it always helps to try to see the bigger picture. As we navigate, and again, Jupiter's in Taurus, so expand your knowledge, expand your consciousness around what is of most value to you. So as we navigate through this Gemini New Moon period, it pays to keep our eye on the fact that while we're planting seeds of greater curiosity about our partnerships and learning how to adapt or pivot to previously revealed information that has affected our view of these partnerships, that we use Saturn's retrograde period from now until November 4th wisely. And that means understanding that Saturn rules Capricorn, the archetypal sign through which Pluto is retrograding now since June 11th until January 20th, 2024, while Saturn's retrograde in watery Pisces now too. So since Pluto's been in Capricorn previously for a total of 15 years, we're now seeing via his retrograde the ugly underside of Pluto and Capricorn. We're seeing that surface so that we can recognize it bring it into the light, and learn from it. There's another correlation over the long term of that's the macrocosm of the microcosm, again, of this upcoming Gemini new moon. So where have the traditions of achieving success deviated during this time into massive amounts of power granted to corporations or authority figures deemed quote-unquote successful by reputation, even if that reputation was gained at the expense of financial and or sexual manipulation, which are two big things that are represented by Pluto, by the archetypal Pluto. And where might such realizations sink us like a stone, while Saturn in Pisces fears becoming overwhelmed, or worse yet, driven mad by such knowledge as he retrogrades through the collective watering energies of the Piscean archetype? In short, how can we use these energies to not lose faith in our future, but rather to learn from our mistakes about trusting the wrong partners because they were interested in their own success more than in the success of the partnership? And where can we change our thinking to adjust to current times? We might start by asking ourselves now, where do we rely on traditional ways of thinking that have become outdated because times have changed? How can we relax our boundaries so we don't simply adhere to rigidly traditional beliefs reflexively, especially when they used to be taboo but now are readily accepted by society? And can we envision a secure enough future because we know now what we realistically need in partnership? For example, are we willing now to place our trust only in those who champion us as much as they advocate for themselves? Discuss amongst yourselves. Now on June 19th, Jupiter in Taurus will exact sextile Saturn, allowing us to understand more precisely what can be realistically achieved on a practical level versus what's based solely on fantastical thinking. So in other words, in that way, we can better know with greater clarity what kind of information truly nourishes us so that we may absorb it into our systems like food and metabolize it to sustain our mental agility. And that, has to do with this Gemini new moon and the adaptation from what came before. And when the Gemini sun quincunxes Pluto retrograde in Capricorn on June 21st, we'll be asked to adjust our tendency to mentally obsess about whatever topics have us in their enthrall by then. And that's especially true when it comes to adjusting our level of obsession with sticking to those old traditional not so great values of yesteryear about, that just don't serve us anymore. So we experience the sun's entrance into sensitive, compassionate, nurturing, but often moody Cancer at the summer solstice, which occurs at 7:58 a.m. Pacific time and 10:58 a.m. Eastern time on June 21st as well. And this is followed by Mercury in Gemini sextile to Mars in Leo and wounded healer Chiron in Aries, with the implication being that these aspects represent opportunities for us to more easily express ourselves about any past wounding without fear now. We may well be able to release what's confused us about who to partner with at the July 3rd Capricorn full moon, when the Capricorn moon opposes the Cancer sun and Mercury and Juno, and Uranus and Taurus squares Venus and Mars in Leo. At that time, the Capricorn moon will admonish the Cancer sun to grow up and stop believing everything it hears or is told by those with whom they've chosen to partner, be that personally, professionally, politically, or whatever. Cancer's emotional, right? So the Capricorn moon's like, why are you listening to those people who are trying to appeal to your emotions? You need to use your logic. You need to think empirically and logically. And at the same time, the Uranus square to Venus conjunct Mars in Leo may cause a sudden shift in such alliances around or as a result of this Capricorn full moon. So as always, we're going to see. But again, what I'm trying to say here is that as we're leading through this, the end of this lunar cycle into the next one, I think by the full moon of July 3rd, we're going to see that pivot that was planted at the Gemini New Moon now or shortly come to fruition. So, again, we'll see. But now as we wane through the second half of this upcoming monthly lunar cycle, to push through its third quarter on July 9th, which will be the Aries moon, square to the Cancer sun, will begin to approach the transiting nodal shift back into Libra Aries, circa July 18th, and Pluto retrograde in Capricorn's cardinal square to the nodes, which will be in Libra Aries, between July 18th off and on through, there'll be more close to exact then, and then they'll separate, but very, very, very slowly, and we're having the approach to the July 18th now, and that'll last through early August. So be sure to tune in again, because we'll follow those developments along with, of course, the other timely astro news you can use. But meanwhile, I want to say a few words about Pluto. So Pluto, newly in Aquarius since March 23rd, calls us to transform on a societal level that which will help us progress the state of humanity for the betterment of all. Now, Neptune, in his own watery sign of Pisces since March 2011, has dissolved the boundaries between our individual selves and that of the collective, creating an environment where a lot of psychological flotsam and jetsam have floated to the surface. And that's been happening for a long time. But it's been up to us to recognize and incorporate into our greater consciousnesses, respectively, what's been floating around in the collective unconscious since then. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to look back now, since Pluto was in Capricorn from 2008 until just recently, how Saturn-ruled Capricorn might form a barrier of resistance to what surfaced from that realm during all that time. So since then, it's clear that we've seen the rise of corporatocracy, the alarming growth in income disparity between the rich and the poor, the formation of hardline right-wing politics, and the development of rigid boundaries between those who fear progress and those who embrace it willingly. And I'll add that that's, of course, not just related to the United States. These are planetary energies that affect everyone. So there have been different movements of this in different countries around the world, depending on where these planetary energies have hit those nations' charts as they are, as they progress. So Saturn, which is now in Pisces until May 25th of 2025, places these two archetypes, leaden earth and dissolving water, the ego's boundaried beliefs and the less conscious wisdom of one's true soul, in contrast to one another yet again. For example, when Saturn squared Neptune in 2015 and 16, it gave rise globally again to a right-wing political atmosphere whereby authoritarian rulers or wannabe rulers were able to co-opt the collective unconscious through fear-mongering, Pluto and Capricorn, in order to influence and ultimately control the masses. So back to the monthly lunar cycle. The other thing that's happened during the Taurus New Moon cycle, which of course, as I've said probably a billion times at this point, is coming to an end at the Gemini New Moon on the 17th or 18th of June, depending on your time zone, is a time when, according to traditional astrologer, did I say this already? Yeah, I think I did, but I've got it here, so I'll say it again, just in case you missed it the first time. Because right now, again, we're in the balsamic phase of the monthly lunar cycle. And that's a time to release things that if something or someone wants to leave your life, let it go. because the space will be filled with the seeds of the new moon. So we find ourselves at this point in time with Pluto, which stationed retrograde in Aquarius May 1st, and then re-entered Capricorn on June 11th, at a kind of crossroads between restrictive traditional Saturn-ruled Capricorn and Uranus-ruled future-oriented humanitarian Aquarius. Now here's some of what Stephen Forrest had to say about Pluto's retrograde back into Capricorn, which will last first until, as I said before, January 20th or 21st, depending on your time zone, at 2024, but then will repeat again between September 2nd and November 19th or 20th of 2024. And I'm quoting from one of Stephen's recent newsletters, so if you are on his mailing list, forgive me for being reiterative, and also if what I've said before may have some reiterative qualities here. But here's what he has to say. And, Stephen, as a professional editor, I do feel that Stephen is one of the better or best astrological writers. And in part, I believe that's because, and I know because he does share his natal chart with his students, that he's a second house Sun, Jupiter in Capricorn. And despite the fact that it's in Capricorn, which makes him wise and makes him a teacher, etc., well, that's what makes him wise, but the Jupiterian part makes him an educator, right? But also somebody who is a really good raconteur, which is a storyteller. So he has a way with words, both in speech and in writing. And that's not, a common trait, especially for astrological writers. So here's what he has to say from, again, one of his latest newsletters. Quote, "Rumors of a new world order emerging due to Pluto's passage into Aquarius have been exaggerated, at least for now. For one thing, the Lord of the Underworld is now abandoning Aquarius, which it only entered on March 23rd, and returning to Capricorn, where it's been stirring up chaos since 2008. That re-entry happens this month on June 10th. That's probably Pacific time. The 11th is the Eastern Standard Time. Hang on, I think I just lost my place. Once back in Capricorn, Pluto will actually remain there for the rest of the year. We're not out of the Capricorn woods yet, in other words. On October 10th, after 4 months, Pluto reverses course and turns direct, but it's still in Capricorn when that happens. It only re-enters Aquarius on January 20th of the coming year. Even then, we're still not in the clear. On September 1st of 2024, Pluto crosses briefly back into Capricorn a second time. That will only be a quick goodbye kiss. Just 40 days later, it enters Aquarius solidly. After that, it won't be finished with Aquarius until early 2044, and it won't touch Capricorn again until February 28th, 2254. With Pluto's retrograde re-entry into Capricorn, all of humanity is being offered a chance to reflect and to heal, or failing that, to demonstrate what happens to us when we avoid doing these things. Pluto's passage through Capricorn and its impending passage through Aquarius are huge topics, both for individuals and for humanity in general. And then he goes on to discuss the high and low of Pluto in Capricorn. Every sign has a high evolutionary meaning and a dark side. With Capricorn, the high evolutionary meaning has to do with integrity and character. Every time you have ever resisted a temptation, for one example, that was the positive side of Capricorn and Saturn at work. And that's where we bring in a deliciously Plutonian question. Of all those temptations you resisted, are there any that you probably should not have resisted? For example, is there someone you should have kissed but didn't? A piece of cake you actually should have eaten? If you'd taken some funny revenge on a scoundrel, might that have improved the scoundrel's future behavior and saved someone else from getting hurt? Not everything we believe to be quote-unquote right actually is, in other words. Capricorn is about trying to be good, and we're not going to shame that aspiration, but who defines good for us? Where do the basic values by which we try to navigate our lives actually originate? Not all of them are healthy or helpful. Just think of anyone shaming you for, quote, not knowing your place. Such people often act as if they are speaking for God. Worse yet, they might convince us of the same thing. Not all orders should be followed. Not all authority is actually worthy of respect. Those questioning attitudes are all part of a healthy response to Pluto and Capricorn. Now, I talk about traditional values, and some of them are truly precious. Values such as honesty, kindness to strangers, taking care of the kids, taking care of the planet, and so on. But there are some other values that also have long traditions. Racism, sexism, and homophobia, for three obvious examples. Think about it. For years, many people actually believed that it was immoral for people of different races to marry, or for anyone to violate gender role expectations, or for people of the same gender to be partners. Just because a value has been around a long time doesn't make it right, but it often does make it sink deep into the bones of society. Pluto's passage through Capricorn, which began 15 years ago, has seen the boil breaking on many of these toxic traditional values. If you think about it, you can see that we're talking about the headlines of the past decade and a half. Meanwhile, Pluto's entry into Aquarius is about the upcoming hard work of defining a new set of values by which humanity can navigate into a fairer and more sustainable future. Now, he points out some suggested reflections for Pluto and Capricorn and says, once again, these topics are too vast for me to cover in a short newsletter. So what I want to do here is to look at it all on a more personal level and to focus particularly on this upcoming 8-month return of Pluto to Capricorn, with the first half of it retrograde. Here's the whole thing reduced to 4 bullet points. Life is hard, but sometimes we tie ourselves in shouldsy knots and make it even harder than it needs to be. It is time to reflect on anything that has been a chronic struggle and source of hurt for you over the past 15 years. Has the root issue been some should that's been sucking the life out of you? Some responsibility you've accepted or self-sacrifice that you felt that you were morally obliged to make? And then finally, ask yourself if anything in those shoulds is really true and legitimately morally binding, or have you been the slave of some personal traditional values that actually have served no positive spiritual purpose for you or anyone else at all? While Pluto has been in Aquarius during these few weeks, or these past few weeks, you may have already gotten a glimmering of a better, lighter path forward. That's good news. But for the rest of this year, think of yourself as being in Capricorn recovery therapy. That means getting yourself ready for some big breakthroughs and changes when Pluto returns to Aquarius on January 20th, 2024. And that's really just a few months from now. Honest inner work and reflection this year lays the foundation for that upcoming liberation. What happens in the world is always the sum of all the choices that 8 billion human beings are making. As you fight to escape the deadening hand of the outdated past as it echoes inside of you, you are setting up a resonance that ultimately helps everyone to create a better, more Aquarian future. And that is humanity's mission for the next couple of decades. End quote. In the shorter term, however, I think those of us in America might want to remember that we're still in the middle of the U.S. chart's Pluto return. If we return to the smaller picture again, we might investigate this astrologically as the breakdown before the breakthrough, which is the way in which astrologers often refer to Pluto transits. Now, given that so much of our recent history, at least during the Trump presidential years, has seen the breakdown and dissolution by some of so many norms, along with the resistance to change traditions by others, I'm thinking of things on the left, like changing the, what is it called, in the Senate, changing the filibuster in the Senate, that those on the left are saying, no, we have to adhere to tradition. There's many different things. Again, Keith Olbermann I was listening to the other day, and he was admonishing Dick Durbin, the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, for not having had a vote on judicial nominees by President Biden when Tommy Tuberville, the senator, I forget if he's from Alabama or someplace, but he was absent because he went on the day of Trump's indictment to Trump's Bedminster, New Jersey address, and so he was absent from the Senate, and that meant that the Democrats would have had a majority and could have passed some of these judicial nominees, which he was the one who was holding up. And Durbin said something like, no, it's sort of like tradition that you don't have a vote when one of the members is missing. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. But meanwhile, so many other norms have been violated by the other side. So again, it's easy to understand that we're at the beginning, we're beyond the beginning of this breakdown, but we're not anywhere yet near the point of the breakthrough. And that Donald Trump has had a lot to do with this, not because he's solely responsible for the destruction of American norms, but rather because he's the symbolic culmination of such destruction. It pays to follow the aspects now to his natal chart. And last week I mentioned the off and on quincunx by transiting Pluto to his Leo ascendant, which has been going on for quite some time now, and that when Mars returns at 2646 Leo, so transiting Mars will hit that degree, which is his natal Mars, on July 4th. It'll become part of that quincunx to transiting Pluto, which will be at 2931 degrees of Capricorn and retrograde. So transiting Mars will then move on also to hit Trump's ascendant, which is at 2955 Leo, and which conjoins the fixed star Regulus, and that'll happen on July 10th, again at 2955 Leo, and quincunx transiting Pluto, which will be at 29 degrees and 0 minutes of Capricorn. Now, I'd be quite happy to see what I'd predicted all along, which is that Regulus brought him up, and it's Regulus that'll take him down. Regulus, the fixed star, is aligned with people who can attain great heights of power, but if they misuse or abuse that power, they will take a giant fall from grace eventually. Now, the only thing to be defined here is what is down to an almost 77-year-old guy whose chart has shown a lot of luck in the past. And since transiting Pluto is flirting with the cusp of his 6th house over the next year and a half too, I wonder whether his health will start to factor into this equation. I think when Neptune squared his nodes and his moon and his sun, which it did at least a year ago, that factored into his mental health. But now I'm talking more about his physical health. So we'll see. But in the short term, Mars will enter his 1st house, and by the first week in August, will begin to square his natal Uranus and his moon and his nodes and his sun from his 1st house. By August 7th, his 3rd house progressed moon will be conjoining his progressed Jupiter and progressed Venus, and they will trine his natal 10th house sun. So at the least, it will be quite interesting to watch and see what happens as these incremental movements play out. Now, Pluto also rules Trump's 4th house in his chart, so the changes there may be the ones most in focus. And traditional astrologers will point to Pluto ruling his 9th house as well, since that's the house ruled by Mars, Aries, Pluto's traditional ruler. But either way you slice it, we're looking at irreparable changes either to the way others view Trump, as I mentioned last week, and or to his legal status, if we're looking at his 9th house. At least that's how I'd read it. And along with his legal status, I'd add his political status. All right, so That's it for this week. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Be sure to join me next week on June 23rd for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.